Hello, everyone. My name is Alejandra Harden, and I'm a second year in the college. I am majoring in economics and public policy, and I am an IOP Fellows Ambassador for Samantha Vinograd. Foreign interference in the 2016 election is well known, but what about this election cycle? With just 2 weeks until the presidential election, we are so lucky to have Ms. Sue Gordon and Ms. Samantha Vinograd for a discussion about foreign interference in the US election. Sue Gordon is the former Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. In this role, Ms. Gordon served as the second highest ranking intelligence officer in the US from 2017 to 2019. From 2015 to 2017, Ms. Gordon served as the Deputy Director of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, and prior to that spent 27 years in the CIA, rising to senior executive positions in each of the agency's 4 directorates: operations, analysis, science and technology, and support. During her tenure, she briefed 5 of the last 6 presidents on national security issues. Ms. Gordon obtained her undergraduate degree from Duke University, where she was a power forward for the women's basketball team. Samantha Vinograd will be moderating this conversation. Ms. Vinograd is a national security analyst at CNN and a senior advisor at the Biden Institute. Before joining CNN, Ms. Vinograd served as Deputy U.S. Treasury Attaché to Iraq under President Bush, and then served on President Obama's National Security Council as Director for Iraq, Director for International Economics, and Senior Advisor to the National Security Advisor. Ms. Vinograd is currently a UChicago IOP Fellow and is running a seminar series focusing on the impact of COVID-19 on our national security. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Gordon and Ms. Vinograd.
Hi, everybody, and thank you, Alejandra, for that introduction. And thanks to the Institute of Politics for hosting what really is the most timely discussion that we could be having right now, as so many of us are getting prepared to cast our votes or to vote in person in the coming days. Sue, I'm so thrilled to be here with you. I don't think that there's anybody better to talk about these issues with. And before we kick off our discussion, I would just encourage everybody to put your comments in the chat section. We'll get to student questions in about 25 minutes or so, and we want to hear from you. Sue, let me kick things off with a really easy softball question. You spent a lot of time with the President's Daily Brief. You know how many different threat streams the intelligence community tracks. From a 50,000-foot level, if you had to walk in and brief the president today, what is the biggest threat facing our country?
Well, first, thanks for having me, Sam. I'm delighted to be with you. I follow you. I think you have an incredible voice that is really useful and really balanced. So I'll give the answer that seems like I'm pandering to the moment, but it's actually the answer I gave to the president almost a little more than a year ago. I think the greatest threat to America are those actions that would make us not believe in ourselves. And so we talk about elections, and that is certainly one of the elements, but the things that are going on to create rifts in our society, to amplify rifts, to increase divide, to make us not sure that democracy is really the way to go, I think is the greatest threat to America. We could go down a litany of economic threats, of weapon threats, of North Korea, of instability, of the proliferation of nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction. All of those are threats. Each one of those, I think, is easier to counter than those actions that undermine who we are.
And we have foreign malign actors trying to undercut what's reality, to diminish the credibility of what our officials say, what we digest as information. But we also have elected officials and intelligence officials that some would say are contributing to that. How has the role of senior intelligence officials, the Director of National Intelligence, for example, how has that changed over the last few years? You served for so many years in the intelligence community. How has the truth to power mantra that guides the IC evolved over the last 4 years?
So I'll give a introduction by saying intelligence has changed over the course of my career. We've had like 3 different major threat epics: the Cold War, the global war on terror, certainly great power competition. But what we're in the middle of right now of a world where the threats are to and through information are really disruptive and really changing not only the targets of intelligence, about where you have to go for the information, and what you have to be able to see and represent in order to do that well. And so I think that's a backdrop that everyone needs to remember, that that's going on. And on top of that, we have a different kind of administration, and we have different kind of behaviors going on politically. I think the role of the senior advisor on intelligence to the president, which is the DNI, has grown in importance. When it was first established, it was really an oversight and policy coordinating position. In the middle years, with Jim Clapper, say, it was the integration of all the intelligence threads into one. In the past 2 to 3 years, the DNI has become both one of the single voices who's advising the president, and 2, even more importantly, the voice, the trusted voice that is communicated with all the constituents. And so it isn't a natural job based on how the ODNI was formed, but it has become an important job of integrity, because you're the one that is both speaking to the American people, speaking to the Congress, speaking to the other departments, and speaking to the presidents. And you better make sure that you're playing it straight down the middle, because it's more consequential than it's ever been.
Well, and so let me push you a little bit on that. You know, I was really struck by DNI Ratcliffe's appearance on Fox News, I believe it was yesterday,
Yep.
where he was speaking about the election, and not about election security, but really about the candidates.
Yeah.
One, can we trust what DNI Ratcliffe tells us in terms of intelligence assessments? And 2, what impact does it have when the Director of National Intelligence is making political commentary?
Yeah, so I'm always hesitant to criticize someone if I wasn't in the moment making the decision in their shoes. But it certainly seems to me that what started out to be a legitimate thread, which is commenting on whether there's evidence to support the idea of Russian disinformation, turned into choosing sides, choosing right and wrong in a dialogue. And the consequence of that, whether it was intentional or not, is it impugns intelligence itself, right? It isn't about the human, John Ratcliffe, of where he stands or who he supports or who appointed him. In that moment, he is representing the discipline of intelligence and the value it has, the singular value it has, besides the information it offers, is that it is independent, unbiased, and it only is what is. And the minute you allow people to believe that the purveyor of intelligence has an opinion on the outcome, then you have called into question the intelligence yourself, and you have invalidated something that is really fundamental to our democracy. So I wish I had been there advising him that if he believed he needed to go on to talk about one thing, I would have tried to tell him the consequence of not playing down the middle is massive, and it has nothing to do with you. It has nothing to do with what people think about John Ratcliffe. It has everything to do with what will people think about the community and the intelligence that they purvey. And that's something you don't want to lose, because it's kind of a constant in terms of truth and foundation. So pretty big consequence of not playing that one straight.
Yes, and you know, there have been accusations of a political filter being applied to other intelligence assessments over the last few years. Something that's anathema to me throughout my government service.
You and me,
I never had any kind of political filter applied to an assessment. It was just, again, what the assessment was. largely so that doubt wasn't cast on whether there was bias in what was being put out publicly or communicated to policymakers. But this brings us to election security. And now that I'm not in government, I'm several years out, I'm relying on what the intelligence community is providing publicly in the forms of these public service announcements and other public statements. We have seen a series of PSAs from the intelligence community. Can you share with us, from a nation state perspective, who the biggest threats are and how they're different?
That's a great question. And I love that you and I think by and large, the American people still see the intelligence community as being truthful when it speaks. You know, that's a hard-won reputation that has been regathered over the last year. So let's do a quick romp around the world. I would always put Russia first in terms of threat, particularly in the context of election security. One, because demonstrated in 2016, so they've been at it for a while. Two, because as an intelligence service, they are experienced. They have a full range of both technical and human capabilities. They're a mature intelligence service, so they don't just have to use one vehicle to achieve their aim. And three, because their doctrine is specifically focused on undermining democracy. And so when you combine the evidence of what they've done, the intent, the ability that they have, and the doctrine that's behind it, I think that is a particularly concerning threat. It certainly doesn't mean that they're the only ones, and it certainly doesn't mean that they're the biggest threat on every front, but it does mean they're a pretty capable adversary who would use this particular moment in a gleeful way to achieve their aim. China is probably the biggest threat and across the board in terms of combination of aspiration and desire to use the strength of America in order to build strength in China. And they have, over the past 5 to 7 years, really figured out how to use the digital environment. Their particular focus is on gaining their advantage, on economic advantage, on intellectual property theft to build their capabilities. So where Russia's aim is to undermine us, China's aim is to build up their dominance. It doesn't mean that they won't use the same tricks in terms of trying to advance various candidates that have China-friendly policies or do those things, a whole range of influence. But again, in the moment of elections, I would put them slightly behind, even though in the overall context, I think China is an incredible threat. And I think it's one that the administration has actually done a pretty good job highlighting. And then you have the North Korea and the Iran who have pretty serious regional issues, but they have figured out that they have the capability to advance those issues through attacks on United States soil. But you need to think about them as their aspiration is a more regional focus, their aim than on the either undermining us or global dominance. But you know, they're about 70. So if you think about 2020 versus 2016, what you have is a lot of people went to school on what Russia did. Russia certainly continued and is advancing, but a lot of other folks have figured out that this is a threat surface and this is a modality that can help them achieve their aim. So what I would encourage people to do when they're listening to information, know that there are people influencing it. And when you hear it, think about what would be the motivations of the actors, and you'll actually be able to sift through it pretty quickly on that which could be false narrative and that which is probably true.
And when we talk about Russia and China, a recent one of these recent public service announcements by CISA and William Evanina differentiated between active covert measures that Russia is undertaking to influence the election versus specifically noting that China was still considering more aggressive behavior to influence the election. When you hear that kind of assessment, what does that mean practically and operationally in terms of how these two governments are or are not trying to influence the election?
So a little bit what I said before, active measures is an old Soviet term. And that it has been an element of their strategy for a long time. And it really applied to launching activities really in the psychological manipulation field that became active. In other words, they released them and then they were absorbed by the society and they took on their own life. And if you think about the combination of that doctrine and social media and the anonymity it provides and the amplification that happens without them having to amplify it, you can see how this is a match made in heaven. Practically, when you see China, they're going to be more targeted in both the individuals that they are going to want to support and the institutions or companies that they're going to want to shape, attack, advance. So one is more societal and more about the messaging in general and watching it ripple through society. And the other is about specific actions to achieve their aims.
Interesting. And on the cyber front, I am still waiting to hear how Russia and China stack up in terms of cyber attacks on our elections. We had the National Security Advisor say that China and other countries have sought to attack Secretary of State websites, for example. I don't think we've heard anything further on that, on the specific cybersecurity infrastructure attacks versus the information attacks. So, you know,
I think, Sam, on that one, I think it's in part because one, the growth since 2016 in protections against physical infrastructure has been remarkable. Not only coordination of government entities from Homeland Security to FBI to National Security Agency, but down to the state and local and including the private sector. So in a weird sort of way, even though you can never be sure that you have everything protected, physical attacks were actually pretty well positioned, if not to stop everyone, to see it when it happens and to do a pretty good job countering it. So I think that's why I tend to talk more about the influence aspects, because it's so insidious and so harder to grasp. And because I think the government and the private sector and the state and local are doing as good a job as I could have imagined when we started this path in 2016. We are so much better prepared.
Well, turning it back then to the information space, did you find that in your briefings to policymakers, you know, on air, I use this phrase all the time, but intelligence is just an input to policy. And if policymakers don't listen to it, it could hit a dead end. In your experience, did you find that members of the administration actually listened and digested election security briefings?
So many, but it's a hard topic because depending on who you're talking to, you have one of three reactions. One is they're the set who hear and they hear it, they think you're questioning their legitimacy and they're going to need to reject it because it's so conflated with their right to be in office, right? If you
I can guess who that intelligence customer is.
But it is a persistent concern when you represent it because you can see it being used in congressional races now to question the legitimacy. Mm-hmm. So one of the reactions is if you're conflating it with legitimacy, chances are you're not going to want to listen to it because you just can't separate the two. And intelligence may be saying, listen, we're not saying anything about you. We're saying about their intent. It's just that they get too conflated. I think that is the most difficult session to be heard in. The second one is the people that want a lot of specificity in order to be able to take specific action. And you know this, Sam, intelligence is really, I talk about how you know if you'd be a good intelligence officer, and it's, do you like jigsaw puzzles? And people say, yeah, I do. And I say, well, do you like it if you don't know the picture? And people are like, I don't know. How about if you don't know the picture and you don't only have a quarter of the pieces? Now you've lost most of the people. And then say, and the president wants to know what it is in 5 minutes to make a consequential decision. So what happens is when you share some intelligence with some policymakers, they want proof. And you know this, that's a hard thing for intelligence to do. So they hear it, but they're not ready to action it because they can't get the proof. And then the last group is one that hears it, they understand it, And now they're thinking, okay, how do I use it without making the situation worse? So I think it is a particularly difficult topic to talk about for those three reasons. What I will say is, despite the kind of verbal food fight that's going on at the highest levels, my comment about how good I think we've become in election security in general physically speaks to a lot of people heard it and it's been advanced, but it's fraud. It's fraud.
And last question for you on election security, and then I want to hit COVID-19 before we go to student questions. And just a reminder to all of our University of Chicago audience members, please put your questions in the chat section. Sue, another easy question for you. Vladimir Putin.
I'm not going to have to do Peloton because I'm like sweating here.
Sorry.
God, you're good at this. Damn it.
Vladimir Putin has been attacking our elections for a long time. The Mueller report detailed, really surveillance operations related to election security dating back well before the 2016 election. So we're several years in. Will we ever be able to convince him to stop attacking us? What's your intelligence assessment on that?
Russia and the Soviet Union before them are going to push until they're stopped. Right. And as long as they find fertile ground, they're going to keep on running the same play, and they're going to keep going until either we deter in a different domain, or we figure out how to protect enough in this one. The problem with Russia particularly is they are so facile on denial. If you look at the Skripal incident with the fourth-gen nerve agent, how many absolute ridiculous denials did they issue? 30?
Sightseeing in Salisbury, yes. And same thing with Navalny. I mean, it's you'd think it was an Onion article.
Right. And if you never stop it, if you never make any consequence, why would they stop? Because people lose patience. How many times do you come back? So they are a particularly difficult adversary. On the other hand, there are some things that I think are in the offing that suggest that there is hope. Number one, and there is such a difficult economic position. Two, they've been the only one having a voice, right? I think there's an interesting question about, as we have pulled back more from international dialogue, what you've created is a vacuum that people like Russia can step into and present themselves as the voice and the leader and organizing principle, and that only gives them range. So I think there's a whole set of things that we need to do, but not until we stop it. They'll just keep taking advantage as far as they can go.
And it's certainly clear from your comments earlier that they don't feel deterred, nor do these other nation states that are attacking us. So I sincerely hope that smart intelligence analysts advise policymakers soon on what will change that cost-benefit calculation, and that policymakers actually listen.
And I think there's some signs, Sam. I mean, I think what Paul Nakasone is doing up at NSA.
I was just thinking of the offensive cyber ops, which is fraught unto itself because of the tit for tat possibility. But I did see that the offensive cyber ops. But I think your point on the economic vulnerabilities is incredibly important, and we'll see what happens. I'm paying a lot of attention to Germany and Russia, and if there's any real retribution against Russia for the Navalny poisoning by Chancellor Merkel. It's interesting. I was reading, I think it was the Department of Homeland Security Threat Assessment, and Chad Wolf was talking about how it's kind of a perfect storm right now, because we have the election happening, the kind of typical election threat environment, but then we also have COVID-19, which has created a whole other set of threat streams. And his point was that domestic extremists, in fact, are taking advantage of this moment. But if you are a foreign intelligence service right now, what have you learned? What has the world learned about the United States during this COVID-19 period?
Boy, if they had been assessing us as 10 feet tall, we're certainly right now no more than 8'3". Right. I mean, I think some weaknesses have shown just in our inability to do a better job managing the pandemic. And again, it was going to be difficult anyway, but no one who can look at us can say that we had this well in hand. The social unrest, I think, is worrisome, but I think more the great divisions in our political system and our running of the government. If I'm a foreign intelligence service, I say, well, they're not going to be able to decide to do anything quickly. They're not going to be able to take concrete action. And then the other thing, in any reasonable term, because they just can't come to agreement, right? And then the third thing I think I'd probably say is their ability to pull together an international coalition against something is probably less than it was. I think there are a lot of things you're still going to see as a strength. Well, my gosh, we're still incredibly abundant in terms of resources. My gosh, we still are such a hotbed of intellectual advance. Our companies, our technological leaders, that's why they come. I think there are a lot of things that make me hopeful and make me choose our system. But if you're looking at us, you see some of those things that probably make us less able to either command unified response or even internally choose a path that's going to be particularly significant.
And I keep thinking about whether this perfect storm of the election, just the normal election threat environment, COVID-19, having various parts of the US government impacted by COVID-19 and not fully on the job, and the fact that now 90% of the American public is on social media, which means that disinformation can spread quickly, whether this is just a time where our adversaries feel that we're particularly vulnerable. And that really speaks to how critical it is to have policymakers that receive and listen to apolitical intelligence analysis. Sue, I have about 50 other questions for you, but I'm going to stop talking. I've been selfish with our time, and I'm going to turn to Jason to ask you a question.
Okay. Hey, Jason.
Hi, my name is Jason. I'm a first year in the college on campus.
Awesome.
My question is, to what extent is Chinese-made technology a threat to national security? And specifically, I'm talking about hardware that's made in China and produced by either American or Chinese companies, but also Chinese software like TikTok.
Yeah, so I think both are concerning. One, because they're so complex. Two, it's really hard to know everything the software does or everything that's in the hardware. But I don't think that's the totally concerning part, because quite frankly, the supply chain and Western products have so many foreign parts in it that you can't assure the security of, that I think it's concerning, but it's not the only one. I think the bigger concern that the government has about China is their security laws that state that Chinese citizens and Chinese companies have got to actively support intelligence of the government anytime they're asked to do so. And so the worry becomes, can the Chinese government compel Chinese companies who own Chinese hardware and software to give the data that runs through them to the Chinese government? So it's not just a technological concern, but it's a security concern. And we could have a whole talk about, is it the software or the data that needs to be best protected? I would argue that if we protected the data, we'd worry less about some of the software. It's a great question, Jason.
So much. Thank you.
And when you solve it, and when you come up with
let us know.
No, I think you've landed on the question of the day. I think that if we can't figure out how to do authentication, whether the software or the data, you're going to see the rise of this techno-nationalism that you see coming, and that isn't going to be good for anybody.
Thank you very much for your answer.
Jason, thank you. And now we would like to go to Adele. Adele, I think you may be on mute.
I was, thank you.
No, don't worry, I was earlier, so yeah.
I do it about 10 times a day. My best thoughts are when I'm muted.
I'm a third year in the college. I'm currently located on campus. Thank you so much for speaking to us about the current state of the intelligence community. read a lot of stories saying that the IC has been fundamentally threatened and compromised by being highly politicized, and there's been all this doubt about intelligence related to Russian election threats.
Yeah.
Do you think that this issue runs, and do you think that news stories ever overblow the erosion of confidence in intelligence? And if not, what does a recovery from that confidence problem look like?
That's a great question. In the short haul, I'm a big believer in the system and the men and women that are careerists, that they do their job. They believe in their job. They have leadership that have told them to keep their eyes in the boat. Sam and I were talking earlier today. I think one of the great misunderstandings is that it's intelligence and policy. Intelligence doesn't demand any particular policy outcome. So I think the people who practice the craft of intelligence understand what their role is, and they push it really hard, and the leaders understand how important that is. Where I worry is that over time, the deleterious impact of either consumers who don't want to hear a particular line of intelligence, question its integrity, not its validity. Questioning validity is easy day. You expect that to happen. Question its integrity, or start suggesting that it can't be trusted or isn't true. What will happen over time is sort of weird second and third order effects, I worry, that the intelligence officers won't bring the intelligence forward, or they'll start adjudicating what they think should be heard or not, or that they'll start leaking information because they think that the public narrative isn't true. And so in a misplaced sense of patriotism, what they'll say is, well, then I'm going to release it so the truth is out there, and then you've broken the whole system. So I worry less about politicization in the near term. I worry more about the deleterious consequences and second order effects if you continue an assault on the institution itself.
Adele, thank you so much.
That's a great question.
Great question. And on the role of the media, I'll just chime in briefly. I think, you know, a lot of us are just paid to share our opinions, and we're worried about everything that Sue is talking about because of the strategic impact it'll have over the coming years, both on recruitment and retention of experienced professionals to the intelligence community, and what the public receives. Informing the public is such an important part of defense on issues like election security. And so some of us are just disturbed by what we're seeing and try to share our opinions on that because we care about national security. So, but thank you for your question. Joe.
Let me just jump on that. I'm on the record of saying, Sam, that I am a huge fan of a free and open press. One, because I've sworn to uphold the defense of the Constitution, but two, weirdly, the media and intelligence do the same job. They just have different modalities. So when I talk about leaks, it's talking about irresponsible single decisions of someone to share a particular piece of information. But a free and open press, particularly in a world that is more transparent and is getting so every day, when confidence in the system is really important, I think is massively important. I am not anti-media at all. I'm more about casual release of information without considering the broader subject. And that's on the person who signed the non-disclosure. It isn't actually on the person.
On the journalist, yeah.
It is not, weirdly, that one's clear. That's such a,
yes.
We could have had a whole hour on that topic, Adele.
The role of me, yes, or even just the violation of these NDAs as these books are coming out from former officials, but we'll save that for another IOP event. Joe, can we turn to you? I don't know if we lost Joe. I see him. There you are. Wonderful.
Hey, Joe.
Sorry about that. Good evening. My name is Joe Palin. I am a first-year Master of Public Policy candidate with global security as one of my focuses.
Awesome.
In regards to foreign interference, aside from the aforementioned players, do you see any new and rising threats among different other state actors or non-state actors?
So I think anyone can buy an offensive cyber capability for about $1 million, right? And everyone is seeing how it can be used. So you absolutely are going to see neighboring countries using it to influence what's going on. And so the question is, where's the interest, right? And, you know, cyber, while it is incredibly effective, to create a strategic effect is actually pretty hard. And so if you remember my answer on Russia, why do I put Russia number one in the threats, is because they're a complete intelligence organization that is much more than just having a cyber capability to go and do one thing. So you're certainly going to see everyone doing it because it's cheap, it allows reach, and it doesn't cost much to get in. Whether you're going to see all those countries becoming strategic threats to the United States, chances are not, just because of what it would take to do that and where their interests lay.
Thank you.
That's a fun question too.
Thanks, Joe. Could we go to Dan next, please?
Hi, thanks. I'm Dan. I'm a third year at the law school and an alumnus of the college. My question is, Russia and China engage in asymmetric warfare, from IP theft to hack and dump to, I've seen recent reporting about mysterious and crippling attacks on US personnel at embassies abroad. And it makes me think, to what extent can we respond in kind by pushing memes of Putin or Xi, for example, without losing our moral high ground? And if we choose not to and completely sort of engage on a symmetrical playing field, are we missing the forest for the trees here, that these are totalitarian, authoritarian, not good states that, you know, by playing by our made up rules that they are not abiding by, we're losing ground in the global race for sort of dominance and power and influence? Thanks.
Yeah, that is a $64,000 question, and I love it. So the digital world has really thrown the world into chaos. It's this great TED Talk by this guy named Eddie Obang, who's a British organizational theorist, and I call it After Midnight. He said we all went to bed, and sometime after midnight the world changed, and when we woke up it looked the same, but nothing that we'd ever done worked. That's really what has happened to us with the advent of the digital world. Everything looks like it's still physical, but it's digital, and we don't have the rules and norms. And in this moment of incredible change and change in the way things are done, democracies look chaotic and totalitarian regimes look focused and successful. And so you're seeing democracies starting to figure out what to do about this, about people who are doing things that they would never do, without becoming totalitarian themselves, right? So to me, I think that's the moment of how do we stay true to ourselves without escalating government privilege over where it is, but still respond. This is where I think the private sector really has a role to play in us. They are unwitting partners in some of these nefarious activities. When our social media companies don't protect against inauthentic things, when our telecommunications companies aren't understanding what happens when they gave away whole parts of it, they have created this opportunity. But that's the rub. How do we not become them? Because, by the way, totalitarian regimes are going to be losers. It will lose in the long haul. How do we stay true to who we are, but bring it back? And the answer is private sector and citizenry, creating a whole of government, a whole of country response that does not make it whole of government by subsuming it. That's the whole moment. And how do we do that? I think we have an opportunity because COVID showed so desperately how interconnected we are, how we were making decisions for one another, and how little we had the ability to force organized action. So I just think that's the moment. But the challenge is, and the mandate is, don't succumb to escalating government authorities, because then we become them.
Wonderful, thanks.
Yep.
Thank you so much. And Sue, I'm going to read a question that a student named Monica Weissman sent in, not only because I'm dying to hear the answer. QAnon, a threat stream that many of us have been following and analyzing. Does the U.S. intelligence community have a responsibility to the public to denounce the QAnon conspiracy theory, which is now spreading not just domestically, but also abroad?
Oh, that's a really good question. And it's brand new. I've not heard it. So it is right and proper that the intelligence community, as our authorities are constructed right now, does not focus on US citizens. It partners with those agencies that have the authority, but it really, as we're constructed, you wouldn't want the authorities that we have that allow us to intercept things on foreign soil to apply that here. So number one is, as constructed, we are appropriately not in the lead. When it becomes something that is creating a national security threat, then I think all agencies have the responsibility to say, okay, what's the proper response to that? And how do we use our authorities to go after them? But it is a particularly challenging one because, as I say, the negative consequence of the intelligence community using its authorities on US citizens is not something that we today are prepared to affect. We do that instead by sharing authorities with the institutions that can. As it spreads overseas, then I think it becomes more like terrorism, and we have a model that allows us to do it. When it stays straight domestic, I think we have some lessons learned, but it's probably not the IC authorities that you really want to lead on.
And it's interesting, you know, I will note that this wasn't proactive. This, I think, was a leaked document, but the FBI has named QAnon as a potential domestic terrorism threat from the law enforcement side. But, you know, to Monica's question, that is very different than an intel official saying that QAnon domestically represents a major domestic terrorism threat. So I'm curious what the FBI director on the law, wearing a law enforcement hat, will say about QAnon.
Well, I think if I were either the president or the director of national intelligence at this moment, having seen what we saw with COVID, I think COVID really brings into relief this question of what are the national security threats today? And what are the tools that we have to address them, the agencies we have, and how do we want to align them to go against it? So I would have argued that climate, migration, and pandemics were not the primary focus of the intelligence community. But in the last 5 years, those have probably been the issues that pose the greatest threat. And so if, you know, you need to remember that the intelligence community isn't about secrecy. The intelligence community is about knowing the truth, seeing beyond the horizon, and providing advantage to decision makers on national security threats. I think this moment is one that says, okay, I know we've done Russian military and Chinese military because that's where the threats were in 1947. Maybe it's time to do kind of a zero-based review and where our focus needs to be, and see whether there aren't things that we need to apply differently than we've done before. And I'm not saying you walk away from all those other things, and I'm not saying that the intelligence community takes on everyone's mission. What I'm saying is the craft of intelligence is useful when addressing national security threats, and you ought to ask yourself the question about, do you need to redesign it some to be able to go after them? It's a question I'd ask.
So I'm going to ask you one last question because we're almost out of time. And this is from a student, an audience member named Claire.
Hey, Claire.
How has legislators interacting with Russian-linked operatives, and I'll just add their intermediaries and disinformation, so such as Senator Ron Johnson during his Ukraine investigation, affected the work of the intelligence community at all?
Probably not the work of the intelligence community, potentially the effectiveness of the intelligence they share and the receptivity to hear something that the IC will tell you without having been told by somebody else that it's not valid. So I think probably it would affect the receptivity more than it would affect the intelligence itself. And I guess maybe in this time of this rampant discussion and influence attempts by competitors and adversaries, we need to go back and do a little bit of counterintelligence training for everybody. You know, you don't actually have to intentionally want to do harm, right? You can be used by people who would shape you to get you to do something even without your witting participation. So I think this influence thing is tough. I don't think it's affected the quality of the intelligence as much as the effectiveness of it when it's presented. It's probably a little tougher environment there.
I could not agree more on the counterintelligence training side. I wish that
Seriously.
everybody would take a refresher. If somebody comes to you with the information that you really want and delivers it to you in an easy way, and you just might want to ask why they're doing it, if they're not another American official. So in any case, Sue, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your decades of service as well. And I just hope that sometime soon we'll be able to do this in person.
Awesome. I love it. Thanks so much, Sam. Thanks, Chicago. And the questions, you all are brilliant. I'm going to be happy in retirement because you all got it. Thanks.
And thanks, IOP. Have a great night, everybody.